Thank you for coming to our program. The way that the public views each of the wars and the way that the military viewed the dependents has changed greatly. And so we are really fortunate to have Tracy was, her husband has been deployed how many times? 4 or 5. Kathy Noneman, many of you know. Her husband Charlie is back there. She has been not only a member of the military herself, but of course Charlie was in Vietnam. And so that will be our Vietnam experience. Marian Lee Fulkerson, which I think most of you know, is our artist in residence. And her husband, Chuck Fulkerson, was in the Air Force. And Army. Definitely Army. We got into this because we did Kathy Noneman's oral history, which is in the back, and if any of you would like to purchase it for the price that we actually published it, it's $18. It's really quite interesting. But we started looking at the way that the roles have changed, both from the military standpoint and from public standpoint. And now we have Kerry Aceves, who is, we have a lot of military brats around here. Her 3rd generation military, and she is an owner of a publishing company that does mountain living. She'll explain that. And Marian LaVoy, her husband John was, let's see, Marine.
Indeed.
Got that one. And both Chuck and John are deceased, but she is going to represent World War II and Korea.
When Patty asked me to do this, I decided, well, I'm back in the Dark Ages because I became a Marine wife in 1944 and was one for 70 years. And we certainly had an interesting life. But I was born and raised in Elko, Nevada in 1925, I hate to tell you. Then I graduated from Elko County High School and came down to the University of Nevada and went to the normal school at the University of Nevada. Well, when my husband and I were married, we were married at the St. Thomas Aquinas Church in Reno and had our reception at the swishest place in town, which was the El Cortez, if you can imagine such a thing. But finding out being a Marine wife, I got the book on being a Marine wife. Things that it said that I just want to share with you. It says, broadly speaking, Marine Corps wives do not come from any single segment or stratum of American society. Their backgrounds are as varied as those of their Marine husbands. Your success or failure as a Marine Corps wife will depend upon your integrity, loyalty, and graciousness to family and friends after you join the Corps. May your lives be very, very happy if you play your part, although not recognized officially. 1/2 of every promotion, every success, and every medal belongs to and depends on you. And then I want to tell you this just blew my mind when I found it the other day. I had to read it, but it was the Masculine Bill of Rights, and I'm sure you will enjoy this. If you want your man to love his home, study the masculine point of view before you begin to decorate. Let him sketch plans with you. Let him see samples. Have him meet the decorator, and never commit yourself to heavy expenses without discussing plans with him in advance. 1, a man has a right to man-sized chairs and to solidly built furniture. 2, a man has a right to good reading lamps, large ashtrays conveniently placed, and a special place for his books and magazines. 3, a man has a right to a study or bedroom of his own. And I never saw a Marine that had a bedroom of his own, I can tell you that. Have a bedroom of his own if space permits, and he wishes it. His judgment in colors should be respected. A man has a right to privacy in his own home, and he will respect yours in turn. Do not rearrange his personal belongings. Do not use his things without asking his permission. It is said that only the greatest of souls can share fountain pens, razor blades, and umbrellas with equanimity. 5, a man has a right to some luxury of his own. He enjoys his big, spongy bath towels, a good light for reading in bed, a good light for shaving, and a convenient place for keeping his liquor and his mixed drinks. Now, I want to tell you, John and I were married for nearly 70 years, and he didn't get these luxuries. I had known John since 1941. He was from Sparks, and of course I was from Elko, Nevada. And he went to flight training. In 1941, he immediately went down and signed up for flight training. He already was a pilot because the University of Nevada was teaching pilots at that time, and he already knew how to fly. When he came back, we decided that we were very much in love, and we decided that we were going to get married, but he had to finish flight training first. So I taught school here in Reno and whatnot while he had flight training. And in the meantime, he returned from the South Pacific. He flew dive bombers in Marshalls and the Marianas. And when he returned, we had decided that I had had a contract already to teach school in Yarrington. I had graduated from the normal school. That's what most of the teachers in Nevada went to 2 years to the normal school. And then they went out and taught. And then when they were finished with the 2 years and with teaching, every summer they would come back and get credits. And then most all of the teachers in Nevada did this at that time. And Dean Traynor insisted that I graduate with the class of 44. I had to wear a white robe, and everybody else wore their silver and blue. And he told me Yarrington was where he wanted me to teach because that's where his daughters had taught and had been so successful. And he said, Marian, I want to tell you this. If I ever come into the classroom and you are not in a dress or you are not in a skirt and a blouse and with shoes and stockings on, I will have you fired. That was the dress code at that time. But anyway, in the meantime, when John returned in 1944, my brother had been killed in Saint-Lô, France. He was in the infantry in the army, and he had been killed fighting from door to door in Saint-Lô, France. And I thought, well, should I leave my folks or not? But then I decided, if John had to go back again, I might be a widow, who knows? And we loved one another and just decided we were going to get married and went on. So I was a civilian, he was a military.
Good morning, I'm Kerry Aceves. When graduated from Anoka, I'm a Nevada native, and I went into the military right after Minogue because my dad said either military or college and wasn't quite ready for UNR. And I met my husband then, and we have been together for 25 years. He spent 4 years in the Navy. He was active duty Navy before I met him. And we have 4 daughters. We love each other immensely because we have a lot of deployment babies. So I have a 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 5-year-old. I'm Irish Catholic, he's a Spanish Catholic. So we meet our quote for the pew at the church. But, I have been a military wife. My husband's been deployed 14 times. His last deployment, he came home 3 months ago from Syria, and we've been through a lot of changes in the military. when we were first together, you didn't get to see him or talk to him, you wrote letters, and now he calls me all the time. I don't know if that's great or not. But I'm very pleased to be here, and I was in the military, met my husband, and then I got out of the military so he could continue his career.
Mary Lee.
I too am a Nevada native. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital, and I met Chuck at the University of Nevada. He was from Idaho and came here because he could live with his aunt and uncle and afford college. So we just fell zip in love. We just clicked right away. And we married before he graduated, and I dropped out of school and became a wife and got a little job and waited until he graduated. And I guess I won't answer my indoctrination question until question number 3. But we had quite the training at from the ROTC department. That's why I did.
I'm Kathy Noneman, and I grew up in Woodland in Chico, over in Northern California. And I was teaching in Sacramento, and I met my husband, Charlie, who was going to navigator training at Mather. And we married and started our Air Force life, but I was a civilian when I met Charlie. And my military experience, I was not active duty. I was a military Air Force wife and did some time with Civil Air Patrol. That's why you see that picture of me in uniform.
Hi, I'm Tracy Sherwood. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I say Nevada, so I apologize to everybody. I can't make myself change. People have been trying for quite a few years. I was never in the military. I'm a military child. I came to Winnemucca because my stepfather retired from the Army. After my mother, she, like Kerry, she decided to finish her military career so that her husband could finish his, and then we moved here to the state. My husband was he was an active Guard Reserve member. Actually, he served with Kerry's husband. He was already in the military whenever I met him. But my stepfather, he had been a drill sergeant at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and he made it very clear to me that I did not have the attitude nor the personality to be in the military, but he said you would make a really great military wife. And, it was honest. It was an honest assessment. I think he was absolutely right. And so he gave me some pretty good basics about what it took to be a military wife. And I think if my husband was here, he would say that I was pretty successful at it. But my husband is retired now. He was medically retired 2 years ago. So he's moving on now with a civilian life and going to school and things like that. So there's a lot of changes. It's a very unique situation and interesting.
How did you survive the base living if you lived on the base? Because I think that is certainly different than should you have had an apartment in the community.
When John and I were first married, we went to San Francisco for our honeymoon. I will get into housing very shortly. But at that point in time, in San Francisco, every window was covered with black cloth. And all of the cars, the headlights on the cars were all semi-covered because they were so afraid that the Japanese were going to lob bombs into the center of San Francisco. Wow. It was very, very interesting to me. And a funny story, we stayed at the Mark Hopkins. You could only stay 1 week in each hotel in San Francisco at that time. And we went up to the top of the Mark Hopkins for cocktails. And John, we started to walk in and it said, "Sir, you can come in, but your wife can't." And he said, "Why? She's my wife." And he says, "I don't care who she is. She can't come in. She's too young." I was 19 at the time. So we had to go next door to the Fairmont, and they did let me in at the Fairmont. They did let me in at the Fairmont. Then we went by train to Chicago, stopped in at the Palmer House, and there was a long line of military And we were at the very end of the line, and I said to John, I don't think we're going to get a room here. Some gentleman came from behind the desk, and he said, sir, come with me. So he went up to the head of the line, and we immediately got a room because he said, I admire the Marines so much for their work in Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and all of this. Well, we were a little embarrassed, but we did manage to get the room. Then the next day, we went to the train station, and we were going to Goldsboro, North Carolina. Well, this is the first I had ever seen of segregation. We walked in to the railroad station. There was a pot-bellied stove on one side, a pot-bellied stove on the other side, a black fountain on one side, and a black fountain on the other side, a black bathroom on one side, and a black bathroom on the other side. On the black side, here are these gentlemen chewing tobacco and spitting on the stove. And on the right side, here were these gentlemen sitting, spitting, chewing tobacco and spitting on the stove. Then we got the bus to go to Newbern, North Carolina, and lo and behold, we got in the front of the bus, but all these poor people had to get in the back of the bus, and that was the first that I really saw segregation for what it was. And we got to Newbern, North Carolina, and of course there was no place to live on the base, so we had to find a place to live. And people in the town of Newbern were renting rooms to the military. They did not want to rent to us at all, but they needed the money. So our first place which we rented was with Mr. and Mrs. Rouse, who were very, very nice, a lawyer and his wife. But the only way that I managed to survive was I said I was a Westerner. I was never, never a Northerner, because the people that made the mistake of saying that they were Northerners were really ostracized. So that, and then at the next place, John got orders up to Quantico, Virginia, for the Air Ground Officers School. There was no place to live there at all. And they had converted chicken houses into living quarters for some of the people that could be there. So we had to go into Washington, D.C. We saw an ad for a house, for an apartment. We walked in, there was a great big room and a small kitchen. And I said, well, where are the bedrooms? The gentleman goes right over to a big window, pulls up one window, reaches over, pulls up another window, and steps over from one building into the next. And there was the bedroom and the bathroom. Well, needless to say, that did not work. So I spent the rest of the time at Connecticut, living in an apartment, not an apartment, in a room there. And the other couple that were with us, she was expecting. So while she was, I would always go down and have breakfast in the morning, and then we would have dinner together at night, and the men would come in from Quantico, and we would spend the weekends together. And of course, since she was expecting, John and I always had to go up into the attic, which had a bed and a bathroom in the attic. So that was what our quarters were for all the time that John was in Quantico.
Did you ever live on the base?
Oh yes, many, many times, but that's years afterwards.
How did you know to say you were from the West? Did somebody tell you?
Just common sense. There was only one black boy in our class at Elko High School, and we all we liked Herschel very, very much, and I just could not believe the way the people were treated down there. If we walked on a street and we were coming and a black family was coming towards us, they'd have to get off the street to let us go by. And that I just could hardly stomach that, but I have many, many tales that there's not time to tell.
Kerry.
I've had experience with both living on base and as you have children, you want to move off base. So I would have to say that when I was real young, that this day and age, it's just very different. Looking at how the base quarters are and how they're allocated from when I was in the military is very different. It has almost like a different stigma to it than it did when my father was in the military or my grandfather was in the military. So I would have to say that most people, when they get to their base, especially if they're single, they're assigned to the base. But most people that have a family, you want your husband off that base. So we, because of the amount of time that people spend away from the base after, in my experience, after September 11th, it's good for young mothers and young people who aren't experienced to kind of, it generates its own type of culture. So when we were starting out, for the amount of pay that we made, it made sense to stay on the base. But as we grew older and our family grew, we decided that we wanted to live off base. And then when my husband came back, and when we moved back after September 11th, there's BAH now in BAQ. And so if you're, BAH is off, it's a housing allowance now. So that came about in the early 80s, the BAH, because there wasn't enough housing for military members to live on bases. So they gave you an allocation to live off base. And uniquely in the West, it is very lucrative to live off of base. But in the East, the people who own houses know what your BAH is, and so they conveniently charge you exactly what your BAH is to live off housing. So I would have to say for community level, I work with a lot of young military wives, trying to get them to commit to be a military wife, which is a lot different now than it was former wars, that it's important to have that base community. But as we grow older and as our family grows bigger, we want to choose where we live and whatnot. And so for the last, after September 11th, we live in Reno, so obviously there isn't base housing, but I have a very unique perspective on both. And I feel like there are some great positives to both. My daughter is now married to a military member, and I tell her not to live on base. I say, use your BAH, find a nice home or a nice apartment off base, and save that money, the balance of that money, so that you can buy a house.
So interesting. So far, we're all so different. Chuck was in the Army, and so they're not called bases, they're called posts, Army posts. And when he graduated, he also was in the infantry, which is the dirtiest of the dirty. He was very proud of it. The infantrymen were the marchers. They wore their boots and marched through the mud. Oh, they call themselves grunts. And our first station was Fort Benning, Georgia, where he went to infantry school for 3 months, only just for 3 months. We lived in all the Army people who've been to Fort Benning have stayed at the Camellia Apartments. That's where we stayed. Those are the places where we stayed. But we had an indoctrination. We had to meet at the post theater. All it was command. All the wives who had just arrived met at the post theater and sat and listened to our instructions of what we could do and what we could not do. This was in Georgia at the same time the segregation was going on. But they told us, we had all these rules. We could not wear slacks in public. We could not put our hair up in public. We had to, this was before hair blowers or anything. So we always had to sleep with our hair in pin curls or pins sticking all over us if we wanted to look decent the next day. They told us to honor and respect the culture of the cities where we lived. That was our duty as a wife. If we didn't do any of these things, it was grounds for being sent away. So we had to toe the line as wives and our children. And thank you. So when they told us about honoring the culture of the community, I was anxious to get downtown Columbus and see what it was like. And I, like Marian, coming from Nevada, was shocked because they had men's and women's restroom and then the colored restroom. Then they had the drinking fountains that were for white and colored. And another reason it was so shocking is that the Army, right after that, fully integrated. I don't know, I suppose all the services did. But my children grew up with going to school with people of every color. It was the most wonderful experience for them. But back at Fort Benning, I was just, I couldn't take it. I told Chuck, at least I'm going to write a letter to the editor. I always write letters to the editor. He, don't you dare. He said, if you write a letter to the editor, you're going to be gone. So please, he just say, don't write a letter to the editor. So I didn't, and I was glad that our time there was so short. After his training, he decided to go to 2 different schools there, Ranger School and Jump School, Parachute School. And for that, he would not see me at all, so I went back to home. By that time, I was pregnant with my second child. I had that little baby. She would spend her first birthday there, and then I was pregnant again. And so I went home and lived with my parents while Chuck went to these 2 schools. Then his next assignment was, as infantrymen get, as the lowest of the low assignments, was Weilflecken, Germany, which was right on the East German border. And this was during the unsettled times, and the Berlin Wall had not been built yet. I was not allowed to go to fly until the baby was 3 months old. Chuck had to leave. He just left right at Christmas and went over to Germany. So I stayed with my parents until my baby Jake was born and was 3 months. Then we had to get to Germany, to Weilflecken, Germany. It wasn't an easy thing because there were no disposable diapers then. You weren't supposed to nurse in public then, so I converted my baby to bottles, which had to be sterilized. And of course there were no cell phones or anything. And so we get on the plane and we flew to New York City, where my daughter, my little baby daughter, got some kind of trouble. She screamed all the way to New York on that plane. Felt so sorry for the other passengers. Got to New York City, then we had to take a cab. We had 2 suitcases, a diaper bag, and a toddler and a baby. And there were no baby carriers then. They were just your arm. I wonder how I did it. I got into a cab and went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. We got in the cab, and my daughter, with her ear trouble, immediately threw up all over the cab. So by the time we got to Fort Dix, the cab driver was so totally disgusted, he dumped us. He just dumped us right in front of the registration place. And I looked at where we were. It was midnight by this time. And there was a flight of stairs that must have been 70 stairs up to the place where you registered. And there I was at the bottom with these 2 babies, 2 suitcases, the diaper bag. But, you know, there's soldiers all around. And even at midnight, they were out having a cigarette. So they helped me get up to the top, get registered. I rinsed the clothes out in this little sink, pulled the plug, and the water went all over the floor. It was really primitive. And then the next morning we left for Frankfurt, Germany, on an old Flying Tiger, World War II Flying Tiger airline. And it was very tinny and cold. It made 2 or 3 stops on the way. But the people were so nice. Other women and children were all on the plane. So we made friends as we went along. And that is one, I think, thing about military people. We remember our old friends. You write to people I still write to people from those first days when their babies were the same age and they're now almost senior citizens. I have lived on army posts. Weilflecken was the worst because it was so primitive. But even then, we were in Germany and we got to travel and we had evacuation routes because of the trouble with East Germany. We had to be prepared at all times to evacuate. The men, the soldiers, they were expecting an invasion, so they would stay and defend it, and we, in our little 1945 Volkswagen, would get in the car and have an evacuation route to either some places east, and I always thought that was so funny, because if we had to evacuate, the Germans would know right where to go, and we'd be lost. I'd be lost. So, yeah, and then we, but Weilflecken, it was primitive, it was hard, there were very small army posts, but we made friends with people in all the apartments on both sides of us, and we did have parties together, and we had our children played together, and it had its benefits. My parents came to visit, and we went to Berlin, and it was amazing. We got to go into East Germany. I think Chuck wasn't supposed to go, being an active military man, but he did. And we were one of the last cars to go into East Berlin before the wall was built. And that was interesting, the difference between East Berlin and West Berlin. And I sure admire that country for what they did, Germany, for unifying the way they did.
Mary, just to, all of you, if you will date things in advance so that some of our younger audience.
I don't remember dates too well. That would have been in the, my son Bob was born there. He was born in, he was born in 1960. And because we were in such a remote post, the nearest hospital was Würzburg, which was about an hour and a half away. And our best friends had had a baby just the week before, and the baby was born halfway to Würzburg, delivered by her father, who didn't know a thing about delivering babies. So when it was our turn to go to Würzburg, the doctor followed us all the way, and I'll never forget the sun rising as we were riding to Würzburg. Bob was born the minute we got there, and after he was born, then they prepped me. Because that was Army regulations. We always said it was the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. Do they still say that? We also went to, another station we went to was Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We might have been there when your dad was there. We were there in about 65, I think. Something around there. But that was the place of copperheads and hurricanes, and Vietnam was starting to pick up then. And so all the men were talking, they were so eager to go to war. There was a theory called the domino theory. And the thing is that there was a belief, a strong belief, that communism was coming our way if we didn't stop it in Vietnam. And I thought that was so foolish. And we had arguments, but it's hard to argue with a man who's determined to go there. So why make him feel doubtful when he's going to war? That's when the discussions all began, was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We loved it. We always lived on post. I think our first salary was $220 a month. Yeah. And I think it might have risen a little bit by the time we were at Fort Leonard Wood. But we had free housing. We didn't have our own furniture. We had military furniture. We had free medical care, the cheap groceries, cheap gasoline, and so it wasn't really any problem living on that kind of money. And then Chuck taught at one time here at the ROTC department, and I'm not going to go into Vietnam, I'll do that later, but then we went to Fort Lewis, Missouri, or Fort Lewis, Washington, which was a great Army post. Rained every day but 2 at Fort Lewis.
Our first station, our first Air Force base was England Air Force Base in Florida, which is up in the Panhandle, and we arrived there in 1961. And Charlie was in B-52s for the Strategic Air Command, which had a culture all of its own. And we wives were also taken to a theater or wherever periodically and lectured to about our responsibilities as wives and what we were supposed to feed our husbands for breakfast, and everything you could possibly imagine was choreographed for you. And one of the things that you were not allowed to do was to work. And on Eglin Air Force Base, it was not only segregated for blacks and whites, but it was also heavily segregated for enlisted people and officers. And you, as an officer's wife, you had a strict code of conduct as to what you could wear and what you could do and where you could go and all sorts of things. Out of probably about 350 wives. I discovered in this wing that we were in, the SAC wing, there were fewer than 5 of us who had women who had 4-year college degrees. And since I had graduated from Chico State, I had a teaching credential and I had 4 years of college. So I decided, since there was a high school about 3 miles down the road, that I would get a job teaching at Choctawhatchee High School, which, unbeknownst to me, created a consternation among the powers that be. So I had to have permission to work. So I had to submit a paper and tell them that there was a teacher shortage in the local area and I was desperately needed. So I was allowed to teach at a segregated high school, and it was in that time, 1962. I had a child, which made it even worse, that a mother, a woman with a baby, would dare to leave her child and go to work. So I had a little bit of a reputation to start with when I first started. But the funniest thing to me was I taught 16-year-olds and I had 165 students. And I taught English. And they had strict rules that everybody had to write, and you had papers, and you had all of that. So I spent my life correcting essays and different writing. But when I applied for the job, and I was interviewed by the principal, as soon as he discovered I was from California, he told me that I was undereducated. And I'm probably not very bright, because everybody knew that the West had the worst schools in the country, something that I'd never been told before. So he said, so you'll be teaching remedial classes, and I think you'll be able to handle that. I mean, that's the way he treated me. And also, he had a decided prejudice against military wives. He didn't really want to hire a military wife because we were not only not from the South, but we had some different ideas, and we could, the family could be transferred at any point. But we lived on base in a house that was wall-to-wall cockroaches. And when I told my mother tearfully back in California that I had a house full of cockroaches, I got a 15-minute lecture on if I kept a good house and was cleaning my house, I would certainly not have cockroaches. But anyway, it was a very, very small, old house that had been built, I think, prior to World War II. And we made, my husband's salary was $222 a month. But we were rich because he had flight pay. And so that was an extra $100 a month. And $100 a month for a lieutenant really made a big difference. I mean, we could go out and buy an air conditioning in a place that was really hot. Of course, the houses weren't air conditioned. They barely had any heat. They didn't have much in the way of insulation. It was, pretty primitive looking back, but it was in the early 1960s, so most people lived that way. I mean, it wasn't that we were living that much, below the poverty line.
You all have said, I can repeat that. My mom was a single mother in the Army, so we lived on post. She was stationed at the War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that was fun, but it was very tight-knit community, so moving from rural Pennsylvania to base or post housing, it was actually off base. The Stanwyck Apartments, that's what it was called. We had a green school bus, so we were the only kids in the school district that rode around in an Army school bus. We got made fun of quite a bit. A retiree drove us. I think that we gave that gentleman illness because we were just awful. But I had a really good time because it wasn't rural Pennsylvania. It was in town. And then when she took us to Germany, to Frankfurt, Germany, it was very different. And you all speak about how officers and enlisted were segregated, but we were put in officer housing because my mom was a single mother and they didn't have any enlisted housing. So we did have some benefit there, and I'm telling you, it was pretty nice. I mean, every time I go back to Germany, I love it. And then when she got out of the service and my stepfather, when they got married, we lived off base. And it was definitely different. The small communities that we lived in that were around the War College were definitely not as military friendly as what Carlisle was. We were definitely not made to feel welcome in some places. And then my husband, he was in the Air Guard here in Reno. We lived off base. We just lived actually right down the road. So it was a different experience. It was definitely a different experience. And I think that whenever I first got married, and knowing that my mom was part of my dad when he retired, he was a non-commissioned officer. So there was wives clubs, there were activities, there was a lot of support when you lived on post. There was a lot of support. And I came here, and at the time, we got married in 2000, there was nothing. I'm like, what about the wives club? No, we don't have that. What about family events? We really don't have that. I think they had like baseball games or something at that time. And no, we don't do that. I'm like, and the big thing was, when's PT? You know, whenever they go and exercise. Because my mom was a single mom. It was in the morning. She's like, Tracy, you and your sister, you're coming to do PT. And we were welcomed. We were the only kids there, and we went every single morning. And I'm like, well, honey, how about PT? Oh, we don't do that except during guard drill. I'm like, really? Because I think everybody probably needs it. And I'm like, I'll just go with you. Nope, they didn't do that. So it was a very different experience living in my own home and having a military member. It was a different and a big culture change for me. And I think because I was so comfortable being a military child and then wanting to transition into that spouse role. So I had some problems there. But I remember cockroaches. We had an apartment that was wall-to-wall cockroaches too, so I think nothing's changed. When we moved to Germany, there was
the same cockroaches.
Probably the same cockroaches. And then when we moved to Germany, there was a family. All their stuff had been dumped in the Atlantic. Yep. And we were like, oh, thank gosh, that wasn't us. Like, traveling over to Germany, my stepfather, when he went with his father, they went on a boat, and he remembers the swings would swing out up over the rails, and they would be out over the ocean whenever they were playing. So a lot of different experiences, but I have to say, you all said something that I can agree with. Oh, so time-wise, if you want time, I graduated from high school in '92, so I'm very bad at dates, very, very, very bad at dates. So in the late 80s, maybe, my mom was in the Army and I went to Germany, so I was in like seventh grade. So If somebody can do the math back for that, I apologize.
I know that orientation was important in the early war years, but I'm wondering what the official orientation for military wives were or was when you married in 2000. Was there any orientation?
There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. However, that might have been because it was a guard unit. Being an active duty spouse, maybe there was something different and I just didn't get it. But I know that when my mother transitioned from being an active duty member to being the spouse of a non-commissioned officer, she did get sat down and there was an orientation for her. So that was in like 88. She had an orientation. So she was told certain dress things, and she was not given a book to read about creating spaces and things like that. I don't think she would have listened anyway. But yeah, there's some responsibilities that go along with that. But not for me, no. They just let me go and be wild.
Marian Convis brought her diary today. And for those of you who know Marian, her husband, Chuck Convis, was a Marine at Iwo Jima. Anyway, this is her diary. And when she was in high school, how old were you, Marian?
I was 15.
And she made a note in her diary, and what does it say?
The U.S. dropped the atomic bomb yesterday.
Yeah, her entry is August 6th, and it says, the first atomic bomb was dropped yesterday. Thank you for sharing that.
That's area, Marian.
We're all afraid of
Just an
the
area.
up here. Thank you, Marianne.
The Air Force had very, very strict rules about how you were to behave and what you were to do. And coming again from the West to a segregated South was, I was just as shocked as the rest of the people, because we were really, I think in those days, very naive about the regional differences in our country. I mean, I grew up thinking, well, everybody can jump in the car and drive to San Francisco and watch the 49ers play, or go skiing, or go to a ballet or an opera. We were all, on those back roads, but wherever we went, we had a cultural, we had cultural advantages. We had things in the West that other people in the United States just did not have. And we were really naive about how the rest of the country was living. And so the poverty in the South was one of the first things that just, I was shocked, I really was, that people in the 1960s were living without power, without running water, no indoor plumbing, any of those things. So I quickly realized how very lucky I had been growing up in Northern California. And I thought we were pretty primitive out on the farm, but I had no idea. But the orientation was, I think, very necessary to tune us in on keep your mouth shut, don't insult the local people, because they have a different culture than you do. They may be living in the same, you may think you're living in the same country, but the culture is different. And you may be outraged by segregation and by the way people are living, but it's not your place to criticize, that part of the culture. And this was the early 1960s, so we accepted that we were not encouraged to speak our minds. Or, in fact, I don't think we were. I think the philosophy was, if you weren't issued a brain, don't use it because it's unofficial.
This is my calling card tray. I found it in a drawer and polished it. It was presented by the officers and wives of our first Army post. And when we had our orientation, we were told about when we went to a new post, we had to call on the commanding officer and his wife. And we could stay for 15 minutes exactly. I don't know how Chuck always knew when the 15 minutes was up, but I forgot all about it. But we had calling cards that we brought with us. And the man, when we'd go visit them, the man, Chuck, would leave 2 calling cards, one for the general and one for his wife. But I would only leave 1 calling card because a woman never called on a man. So it just seemed so important at the time. It was important. We had mandatory, the coffees were informal and they were nice. It was fine. But I wasn't really very social, so it was always hard on me. And we had coffees, and then the higher up we had these teas, and where you had your silver service, and if you were asked to pour, that meant you were in favor of the general's wife or the commander's wife, and oh, your husband would be so thrilled if you were asked to pour. And I think now where I am is, I've got this, but my gosh, that was so long ago. I had something else to say about that, but I can't remember what it was. So I'll just say I know cockroaches too. From Fort Benning.
I was at Fort Leonard Wood, and I think those same last year. I think the houses are still the same. Yeah, the original bag base housing is still standing at Fort Leonard Wood. I went and watched my sister's graduation there, and they took us on a tour, and they are the original houses are still there.
Oh my God.
And I would like to say something very unique to orientation. Being a military family member, my grandparents were very high in the military, and so we always had to be very prim and proper to anything that we attended. Anytime we went, we were always briefed. I come from a very heavy law enforcement background, so everything that I did as a child growing up was very, well, my parents sent me to Catholic school, so evidently I needed more help. But when I came into the military, there's a different type of orientation now. And listening to you ladies talk about how they bring you in and they teach you what you should and shouldn't say, and how you should respect and not respect, or don't say this or don't go there. In the 20 years that I've been involved with the military, unfortunately, we brief our wives and our family members on safety now. And it's not, well, we do tell them not to tell off the commander. Because women these days, let's just be, we just don't have the patience that you ladies have or have. And I have a really, really hard time with not walking in and telling them, what are you doing? Like, why can't we have a party? But we don't have a formal, we did not have a formal wives club or orientation or anything. A lot of the women that came into the National Guard here in Nevada, and I would like to tell you that the Nevada State National Guard is the most deployed National Guard out of any state running for the last 7 years, which means per capita we have more people deployed at any time than any other state. And why is that? Because we're awesome. The reason that we have that is because, one, we are the only National Guard unit left in the United States that has C-130s. The C-130s are being decommissioned, and they were all rolled over to the Air Force. And our leadership, our governor, and the people in the military in Nevada would not allow that to happen. To let our planes go. We are the only operating C-130 Guard unit transportation we have a drug interdiction plane, and we have a now changed over fire. So something that Nevada has done uniquely different than the other states is we've changed with the different military clout that has happened to make sure that we are still very military. And Nevada is a very patriotic state. I'm very proud to be from Nevada and be from here. We have the intelligence wing. So when they were going to try to take away the National Guards, we diversified and we became an intelligence wing. So we're one of the only National Guard units in the United States that have a dual mission. We have a flying mission and an intelligence wing. And then we have the Army, and the Army has 6 different missions. So when you look traditionally at an Army or a military base, we don't have that. And so we don't have the ability to walk across the street and say, oh my gosh, I have not heard from my husband in, they tell me now I haven't heard from my husband in 6 days. I'm like, feel happy you have not heard from him in 6 days. But it's a very different climate. And so what we tend to do in our unit is every unit's kind of, I'm a security forces unit, so all of our wives are kind of together. And then there's this unit and this unit. There have been huge things that have happened with the Yellow Ribbon program and the Family Services program and things to try to reach out. But the thing that has changed and is so important now, it's not about protocol anymore, it's about your own safety. And because of the different things that happen to our military members now, it's more of an education. Like I personally call anybody that I know that's coming in or anybody that's coming into my unit and I'm like, what do you need? And so I think from where my grandmothers came from to where they would go and be, poor and, don't talk unless you're talked to. My children don't understand that. So to be able to be part of that evolution of where military wives were and where we are now, we're very much in charge of reaching out to others and giving them those orientations because we don't have a formal orientation. And even on active duty basis, I just sat at the Travis orientation for women and for families. It's all about safety. There's no protocols anymore. It's about if you leave the base, you do this. And I personally am very sad about that. I think we should have a T because we deserve it.
The policy of the Marine Corps was, the Marine Corps always said, if the Marines were supposed to have a wife, they would be issued. And believe me, we had protocol from top to bottom. And we're told exactly what to do. And the calling cards, we always had to have our calling cards. You had to be dressed in your gloves and in your hats and spend 15 minutes with the CO. And then in return, in a few weeks, they would return to your quarters and do the same thing. And one of the funniest things that ever happened, we were stationed in Edenton, North Carolina, and had just rented a home there. And we decided it would be very nice if we lit the fireplace while the CO and his wife were there. So John got all this wood and put it in the fireplace and everything else, lit the fireplace, and the house filled with smoke. Bees or hornets had closed the chimney off. And so if you could have seen my husband trying to get the wood out of the house and out into the yard, and me using a fan and trying to get the smoke out of the house, it was just hilarious. But when they came in, they were a very nice couple. And even though their eyes were watering and their noses were running and whatnot, still, we had a very nice visit. But I want to regress just a little bit. In 1949, when we lived at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, there was no housing when we first got there, and that was the last time, I believe, that we didn't live aboard base. But the Army had decided that Holly Ridge was no longer a fit place to live. But you might as well know, the Marines, we got quarters at Holly Ridge. John and I walked in, and it was a cement block house. It was a duplex. And the kitchen was completely black. And we couldn't imagine what the problem was. So then we found out that it was an old kitchen stove, that you put the wood and the coal in and whatnot. And the heat for the house was a pot-bellied stove that was in the living room, and the coal had to go into that too. Well, John found out that we could change the kitchen stove to a gas unit that he put in, but it took us 3 full coats of paint to cover the black that had been in the kitchen.
Wow.
And then the cockroach stories just continue on and on and on. And our neighbors, the man was the head of the postal department for the Marine Corps. And I saw a few cockroaches and I thought, oh, we've got to do something about this. So John brought home one of those old pineapples, you know, that the Marine Corps used to fumigate everything. So he unscrewed the top of the pineapple and we took our 2 kids and we headed for Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, when we came back, our neighbors were just fit to be tied. The cockroaches, which had been between the blocks of the house, all went to their side of the house. And she had 3 little boys, and they were trying their best to get cockroaches out of their house, you know, the dead cockroaches. And we walked into our house, and I am not kidding you, we had 7 dustpans full of cockroaches. And to put them out, of course, dump them in the garbage. But after that, we had quarters for most of the time that we were in the service. And I will say that it was very close-knit. We had to make our calls with our cards and everything else. And I was very active with the Officers' Wives Club because that was one thing that you had no choice. You had to be. And we had a book club at Camp Lejeune that it was my choice, my chance to have it at my home. And my 2 little boys, I had fed them and was going to put them to bed for their nap. And Matthew, I said, what are you doing in the living room? Because he should have been in the kitchen. Well, put him to bed and whatnot, and the ladies arrived, and there was a Navy captain's wife that happened to belong to the club. She sat down in this green chair, and she very quietly said, Marian. And she lifted her hand, and her hand was filled with peanut butter and jelly. I was mortified. So very quickly, I went and got a washcloth, and wiped off her hand, and wiped off the chair, and I could have killed my youngest son. I don't mind telling you that. But our life in the Marine Corps, we lived in quarters from then on, and when we went to Hawaii was beautiful, just beautiful. There were 2 hotels there, the Royal Hawaiian and another one that I don't remember the name. It was just gorgeous living there at that time, and they had birds of paradise you can no longer see them. They can no longer be brought from Indonesia. And the people were wonderful. And my dentist happened to be a Chinese gentleman. And John had rescued so many people that his name was in the newspapers and all of that. So the dentist invited us to his fraternity's big function. We were the only Howleys that were there. And let me tell you, with these Chinese people, now this would be in the 1950s, between every serving, they had to have a shot glass of whiskey to clear the palate. And by the time that we got home, I will assure you, our palates were very, very clean. Then John headed off for Korea. I think I have the dates correct, but he was a pioneer helicopter pilot, and his job was to go behind the lines and bring out the wounded. And it was so cold in Korea that they would have to take the oil out of the helicopters and bring them into their tents and put them on the stoves to keep the oil so that it wouldn't freeze. And every time that he would go out, he would have to take the oil out, and of course the enlisted men would put it in the helicopter, and then they would take off and would go and behind the lines and pick up the wounded soldiers or say whatever they were and take them to the hospital ship. And now when I see all that's going on in Korea, I just have such mixed emotions because the people were in such dire poverty there. And when he returned from there, then we went back to Washington, D.C., but we'll talk about that later.
I want you to hold up your
Marine Corps white book, because that's got to be a classic. The Marine Corps white what she ought to know about the customs of the service and the management of a Marine Corps household. Now, obviously, the communications has changed over the years, but how often and what type of communication when John was deployed did you enjoy?
Well, it was basically just letters back and forth. It was letters back and forth, and we wrote to one another at least 2 or 3 times a week. I was home with the 4 children, and he was busy, naturally, flying. In Vietnam, it was very interesting because he took a squadron, the HMM 364, to Vietnam, and I have, it was very, very interesting that the young people that were there were such a charming, in his squadron, were such a charming, charming group of young people. You just could not help but really admire them all. And he was very fortunate in bringing them all back. And I have a letter here that I'd like to read to you, that there were 6 of the young men. They were the young pilots. They were 20 years old, and they were in Vietnam with John. And just recently, 6 of them decided that they were going to get together in Savannah, Georgia, at the home of Ray Rideout and his wife. And I got the sweetest letter from the woman who was the hostess at the time. And she said, "Marian, you would not believe the number of times you and Colonel LaVoy's name have been mentioned with love during this mini reunion. We have all long agreed that the 2 of you started this all out right. The young men and wives admired you both. As we have all aged, we admire you even more for your wisdom and the wonderful encouragement that you provided. I was so young when I met you and knew nothing about the military. You were so wonderful to provide the knowledge I needed, but even more, gave me the love of the Corps. You have always been my example of the perfect Marine wife. You did everything with such kindness and grace. You helped me gain confidence, and Colonel LaVoy told all the wives that he'd bring all the men back safely, and he did. I hope one day before long I can see you again. I would love to have you come and stay with us in Savannah, but if not, I'm so hoping that you will be able to come back and visit with us. I am so glad to know you and hope that you are doing well. Hugs and love, Tony." And I tell you, after 28 years of being a wife in the Marine Corps, that is one of the dearest letters that I have ever received. In fact, it brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. And I might add that of my 4 children, my oldest son was in the Marine Corps. He put in 28 years and was a pilot of HMX for President Reagan. And now he is a undersecretary for HUD working for Ben Carson. My other 3 children are all very, very successful, and we owe it all to the United States Marine Corps. Semper Fi.
My husband and I write letters all the time, and we still write letters because there's just nothing better than getting a love letter in the mail. And even with his deployment this last time, even though he called me all the time, so let me just back up. When I first started in the military, we went to Desert Storm. We had a 15-minute video call that we got to have during the 1-year deployment. And it was like we went into the chaplain's office and we sat in the little desk and we saw him and he saw us. And then we received calls. He was given a 15-minute call every 2 weeks. And that was in the early 80s. So to think of how communication has progressed in the military from our first deployment over 22 years ago to our last deployment, where he had his own cell phone and could call me all the time, or I could call him whenever I needed to. I talk a lot to military wives through Military Spouse. It's a call that I do once a month with a Marine wife, an Army wife. I represent the Guard. And women get upset because they can't hear, oh, he should have called me, or how come I haven't heard from him in 4 days? And I have to stop back and think about that. My grandparents got one letter during the war, and it just said, it was this beautiful written love letter, and they're there because they're doing a job, and they're busy. And something that I've learned from very wonderful military spouses before me is that my job is to make sure that the house is okay here, and that he only hears the great things that are happening, and only is communicated that we love you, we're here, just be safe and come home. And I think if I had to say something, in my opinion, I think the communication in the military should be regulated, and it should go back to a 15-minute call, because God knows I love him dearly. But when he has a cell phone, he can call me at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, what are you doing? I'm like, God, love you. But then again, when the war started, I didn't hear from him for 29 days. 29 days when we went into Iraq. And those were the longest 29 days of my life. And then to have that phone call when they finally called, I can still remember the exact where I was and everything. So I've been through a very long change in 20 years of communication, and I firmly believe that the most cherished things that I have from my husband are the love letters that he has sent to me, and the communication that we have, because it's written and it's there. And I would prefer our soldiers overseas, for the sanity of their wives, not to have the ability to call and talk all the time. I think it's a very hard burden for us here in this new generation of instant media and this new generation of communication. It's very hard for women, especially since we don't have that tight-knit community, to be sitting there like, oh my gosh, I just watched the news, something just happened and I can't call him, he's not answering. Well, he's kind of busy. So that's what I have to say about communication.
That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way. I opposed the war in Vietnam, and Chuck was so wholeheartedly ready to do his duty that I swallowed that. I didn't want him to go off knowing. I just quit arguing with him. I just wanted him to go. But after he got there, we wrote letters. I should have brought the note my little son wrote to him one time. He saved it, went through the both. He was there for 2 tours of duty. But we wrote letters, and we made tapes. And we would send him a tape, we'd all talk, and everybody would tell about their experiences, and then he would send one back. But he was always really careful not to. He didn't want to burden us with anything, so we never really knew what I found out later, what he was going through. We did have one thing that I had done while he was gone is that I tore up a bed sheet and I wrote, "Give peace a chance" across it, and I taped it to the outside of the house. And but the kids it wasn't a very popular belief back then in patriotic Reno, but that was the way I felt, and but the kids were told not ever to tell their dad about that sheet that was hanging on the outside. But one thing that we had were ham radio operators, and I think all across the country they did that. There was one in Carson City, and somehow they could connect the two of us every once in a while. We never knew when they were going to get a connection, but it was such an experience that he would call me and say, "I have your husband on the line." Start talking, and he said, "You have to talk and then say over." Then the person on the other end says over, and then the ham operator hears the over, and then he switches over. So this one time, Chuck and I and the kids are all grouped around here, and I said something over, and then Chuck said something over, and I go, "Over what?" And I said, "What?" And the ham radio operator said, "He says he loves you." I just told the kids he says he loves you. It was kind of embarrassing. So I'll pass it on.
What she was saying was there were Mars stations, and there were ham radio operators all over the country, and the calls would come in from Southeast Asia, and then people who were manning their ham radio stations would pick them up all over the country. So you'd get a call and they'd say, I have a collect call from North Dakota, or I have a collect call from Pennsylvania, or wherever, and you knew then that it was that Mars operator who had picked up your call, and it was coming through. And Charlie was flying out of Thailand and was also stationed in Vietnam. And the children and I were living in Chandler, Arizona, which was the last. Charlie had been an instructor, pilot training instructor at Williams Air Force Base, and I had a kindergarten, so I had stayed in that local community. But the interesting thing to me was our Mars station was Barry Goldwater, who was the United States Senator for Arizona. And he had, of course, a beautiful mansion up on a hill, which was a perfect place to pick up calls that were coming in. Now, when a call was picked up from Minnesota or someplace, you eventually would get on your phone bill that you'd had a collect call from Minnesota. But when Barry Goldwater station picked it up, he never charged. So he was, and sometimes when he was home, you would actually get Senator Goldwater, who relayed the call to you, and you said over and all that. But Chandler, Arizona was a very supportive community. And Charlie and I wrote letters back and forth. We sent tapes as well. But our mailman was such a dear that when I didn't get a letter from Charlie for several days or whatever, he would knock on the door and check to make sure I was all right and say, I'm really sorry that I don't have a letter for you today, but I just know you'll get some tomorrow. You know, he was so, and people, talk about negative experiences that they had, during the war. We never had those. People in Arizona were just really wonderful. But in listening to, the military backgrounds of all of us, a statistic I read recently, only 1% of American families are now represented in the military. And of those, 30% are military families.
So I have to repeat what Kerry said. The last time my husband deployed, he was on the other side of the world, and we had like a schedule, and if we missed the schedule, he was more upset than what my son and I were, because it was summertime, he was out of school, I had splurged and got us passes to Wild Island, and he was like, Mom, I actually talk to Dad more now that he's deployed than I do whenever he's at work and I'm going to school and we're doing stuff. So it was a very unique situation comparing it back to whenever I was young and my mom went to Korea and did a tour in Korea. And I remember that I come from a divorced family, so I have a stepmother and some stepbrothers. And the school that we went to, My mother was the only family member that was in the military that was overseas serving active duty in the military. So when my sister and I would get letters from my mom when she was in Korea, we would take them into school. It was a very small rural school, and we would share the information. She would send pictures from Korea, and we would share them with the whole school. So the whole school lived with us for the 2 years that my mom was in Korea. So she would send pictures, she would write letters to our classes, and she would also, when she sent my sister and I souvenirs back from Korea, she would send things for my brothers because they were part of our family, and she treated them, you know, special, so that they would have something special from her deployment. And it was very different, and I remember I'm very, very close to my mother, and every time she would come home, I think she was gone for 2 years, she came home maybe, I think twice in those 2 years. I have separation anxiety, so I would be very ill whenever she would leave, and I would be very excited when she would come home. And I remember my teacher saying, "Oh, Tracy, I know that you don't feel well. I know your mom's back, but remember, she sends a letter every month, and you'll get to share that with the school." So it was very supportive. It was very different than what my son sitting in front of the computer, looking at his father, going, "You know, Dad, I don't really have anything to say. We went swimming. And we watched the Olympics. The Olympics were on the last time that my husband was deployed." So it was very different, and I have to agree. The letters that I shared back and forth with my husband, and those cute little things that my son, I would help him write, and the pictures, my husband has those, and I have those letters, and I think that those are going to be the most meaningful things that he will share with his children, not the, "I don't want to talk to you" type thing. You know, and it wasn't because of lack of love. It was just, it's so easy to communicate that it's like, wow, it is very easy.
We could go on, and I wish we could, but we can't. So what I would like you to do is just each one of you sum up in retrospect my time as a military spouse was, and just kind of put an end on how you feel that your military life affected you and your family.
In retrospect, I would have to say that my time as a military spouse was exciting and different. I was one of those wives that went to the commander and said, "Do you think you're making the right decision there?" I was. That was me. And my husband was very embarrassed and angry, but I had that right. And I was told by a stepfather who was a drill sergeant and who was an NCO, "You have that right." So I took advantage of that right. And it was frustrating, and I would never change a moment of it, because I'm so proud of the example that my husband has given my son, and that he will give our grandchildren, hopefully, in 10 or more years. And I am proud that, although I was not suited to be in the military, I was able to serve my country by supporting someone who did.
Well, in talking about cockroaches and all of the hardships that go along with military, we all have to admit it's an adventure, it's fun. I think that in spite of all the crazy things that happened over the years, it is a fun way to live, because you get to live in some really crazy places. We lived in Germany, we lived in England, we lived in Turkey. Our children are survivors. You could plop them down anywhere in the world and they would do just fine, thank you. So I think that we're all proud of what our husbands accomplished, what we were able to accomplish. And as I said, it was great fun.
Yes, it was. Those are the memory years, the years of the military. I think my children too, they could meet anyone and be friends. They're not, nothing slows them down. They like everybody they meet. When we would go to a new Army post, which after Vietnam we moved every single year, in the middle of the school year. So they had to go to a new school every year, in the middle of the year. And they had a pact that the first one that made a friend had to share it. So I know I've heard that a lot of military children have problems because of those moves, but fortunately mine didn't. I think because they were so close to one another. But the patriotism is one thing that stands out with me. You know, you can be opposed to the war and be patriotic, and I certainly was. And on every post, it was interesting, when we went to a movie, the movie started with the Star Spangled Banner. And you stood up and put your hand over your heart and nobody talked while that loudspeaker blacked. And you just felt the twinges of patriotism. And another thing, when they were lowering the flag in the afternoon on an Army post, I don't know if it was with other people, but if you were driving the car, you pull over to the side, the driver got out of the car, hands over heart until taps was finished. And that instills a feeling of great love that I won't say it's missing because it's present, at least in the military people. The other thing is this war, it was so tough on Chuck and on me and on our kids. He felt the war wasn't fought to win. It was not fought to win. The first time he really struggled with it. The second time it was enough for him. He said they weren't even using the right tactics on the ground. Maybe the air was different, but on the ground it was not the right tactics. He resigned his commission and later, fortunately, got back into through the National Guard so that we got some retirement. But after he resigned, he never stopped being active with the Army, and he was a veterans man, and he headed the Office of Veteran Services. He was the person who started the Veterans Guest House. And after he died, I was looking through his things, and he had a picture of him when he was a PFC, when he first started college. That's the one he wanted in his obituary. It's not the one I put in because I didn't see it, but it was a great time. And I'm still writing to people from our very first Army assignment, so I'm lucky.
I have 3 more years of being a military wife, so he says, for the last 10. 3 more years, honey. I'd have to say that in this day and age, we are uniquely superheroes because not only does the American family not stay together very often anymore, a military family is, the percentages, we just went through a conference and the percentages are so high. And it really takes just a genuine love of a soldier to be a military wife because you are put in front of so many different objectives. And to be able to sit here with all of these ladies and know we are all bonded by the same, whether it was the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 1910, we all have a commonality, and that's just a sisterhood that you don't find anymore. And just real quick, yesterday, I have 4 daughters, and yesterday I went to UNR, my beloved UNR, and I had to critique because I felt it was important. As a military wife and as a patriot, I'm a veteran, put a hatchet through the flag and it's art up at UNR. And my husband was like, oh dear Jesus, can you please not get on the news or get arrested? Take the baby. Because they won't haul you out if you got the baby. My 5-year-old, I was very together, and I'm very, very, very passionate about military wives, military life, the military. No matter what's going on, we serve for each other and we serve for the people. And my 5-year-old looked at me yesterday and she just said, "You're a superhero, Mom." And there's a nice little quote about Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman isn't a person, it's a state of mind, and I really believe to be a military wife, we are all Wonder Woman.
I tell you, John and I were married 5 months short of 70 years.
Wow.
So I was a military wife for 70 years and still consider myself a military wife. We had a wonderful time in the military. We had sadness, we had gladness, and everything else. But my feeling is I will always love the Marine Corps. And I think the attitude that sums up the way that I feel the most was Marcus Aurelius had a saying. He said, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself and in your way of thinking." And I think that is so very, very true. And that's very much the way that I have led my life. And thank you very much for putting on this program.
Thank you.
Made possible by the generosity of Estelle J. Kelsey Foundation.